Hey guys. So today's topic is going to be my theory on how I view changing the rules in general. Just for total transparency here, I'm on the Spikeball SRA board, so Spikeball Roundnet Association board, and it's our job to create the competitive rule set for the coming season. We also create, the point structure and just all that stuff. Everything surrounding competitive play, we kind of weigh in and we take what we hear in the community, our own ideas, other people's ideas, we expand upon them and hopefully create what is the best outcome for our sport in order to keep pushing it forward season after season. We have a lot of different people on the board, so my role on the board is kind of the hyper competitive player. We have a lot of other competitive players as well, but we have people that are in the company on the board. We have people that are more on the casual side of things, or people that run hubs as opposed to talking about competitive play. And the reason why we have such a diverse group of perspectives on the board is to make sure that we're not just writing the rules for any one type of person. So we obviously have an emphasis on competitive play because that's where our tournament rule sets are going to go. But we're kind of getting the perspective of everything. And it's important to actually have people that are on the board from the company as well, because they're the ones implementing this. And what they're there to do is tell us what's actually feasible with the investment that they're able and willing to put in. So that kind of shapes things as well. Like the board, as a competitive player, I can't just say hey, I think you guys need to put $1 million in prize money in, and then we're all competitive players and we all just vote that, and then Spikeball has to give us $1 million. It's not exactly how this works. So there's a check there by having some people that are in the company and kind of telling us what's actually feasible, the actual cost of associating these things, and bringing them to fruition. That's a little bit about the board. And so all I can do is say what the process that I go through when I'm trying to craft a new rule, or I'm critiquing someone's idea of what a good rule set would be. All of these things they're tough and they're multidimensional, and I think that some things get oversimplified or lost in the conversation when people are just this is the answer, we have to do this. And I don't think people actually go through the process of deciding or thinking about it from a myriad of perspectives and analyzing the shortfalls of what they're suggesting and building upon that. I see people put half-baked ideas forward all the time, and it's very easy within 5 minutes for someone that kind of disagrees to go here's the shortcoming of that. And then they go, well, I don't have an answer for that. So one, I think it's really important to put forward whole-baked ideas. There's a time for conversation, and then there's a time for solutions. And at some point, we can't just keep having conversations. We have to start putting forward solutions. So I want to go through the theory in my mind of crafting rule sets for sports. And this is largely shaped by a bunch of research that I've done over the years. Once I was on the board, I was like, all right, what do I want to bring to the board? Obviously, I want to bring that perspective of the competitive player. I want to report what I'm seeing on the ground. I want to compete or report what I'm seeing in the metagame. But also, I want to come up with solutions that are based in fact and precedent for other sports. We're such a new sport, and the joys of having a bunch of other sports come before us is that we can learn from what they've implemented or tried to implement. Sometimes with not very much success, and other times to great success. So I've kind of looked at a bunch of other rules, and you'll hear me talk about parallels to other sports as we go through. And I might give an example from basketball. I might give an example from football. The majority of things are going to come from volleyball and beach volleyball, which are by far and away you can't argue anything else. By far and away the most analogous to the sport that we play. especially beach volleyball, it's 2-on-2, it's rally scoring. You have to alternate contacts between you and your partner to progress a ball towards an objective, trying to score. You rally back and forth until someone scores a point. Anyone that says like, no, actually, round net's more like tennis. Or actually, no, round net's more like soccer. I'm like, you're wrong. This is factually true, but it doesn't mean that we can't learn other things from other sports. So I'm going to talk about my 3 like founding principles that I go back to all the time, and especially in an ideal world. And then we'll get into some theory crafting as well. So the 3 things that I always come back to in my theory are: 1, it is far less ideal to nerf a skill that is viewed as overpowered than to buff the counterplay to this skill. This basically comes down to buffs are greater than nerfs. And if you're not more of an esports guy or, in the trenches of talking about rules, a buff means that we're making something stronger. A nerf means like turning a gun into a Nerf gun. We're making it worse. I would contest that it is better for the long-term growth of a sport and just in general to buff something as opposed to nerfing something. So if we see that something is overpowered, let's buff the counterplay to that as opposed to saying, this is too good, we have to make this worse. 2, any nerfs that do occur should be 1, minimal, 2, manageable, and 3, are ideally the ancillary result in rule changes that create real benefits in other aspects of the rule change, such as rule clarity, ease of officiating, etc. So, what do I mean by this? 1, when we're trying to rebalance something, if let's talk about like offense to defense in Spikeball. Obviously, offense is better. If we're trying to balance that, we can do a couple of things. And as soon as we start, so if we start nerfing this, then we have less mass total, and they'll start to even out. If we buff defense, it goes up. It will also balance. And there's also combinations that you can do on the margins that are a little bit of both. So as a result of buffing anything, inherently there's going to be a little bit of a nerf to that skill, meaning that it's just a little bit less effective. But achieving that by putting more mass total on the scale is way better than taking something away and having less mass on the scale. That mass equates to skills and ability and freedom and the sandbox nature of a sport. It basically is pigeonhole, like the more mass you take away, it starts pigeonholing you into how you're supposed to play. So in my mind, I don't want to be doing that. So nerfs that do occur should be minimal, manageable, and are ideally the ancillary results in rule changes that create real benefits to other aspects of the sport. So I'm willing to concede a little bit of a nerf to something if it has a material benefit on the other side. Now, if there's a material benefit that drastically nerfs something, I would say that's probably not ideal. Final thing, 3, creating a series of smaller changes to a sport, especially in the early meta, is healthier for a sport's long-term development than drastic changes to address any current issues. This is taking a little bit more of a hands-off approach, and it's not saying like, it's not laissez-faire and saying like, we're not going to do anything, the market will decide what the market decides, but it is saying that we don't need to be overly interventionist, especially at the beginning when we're just figuring out what our sport is. Every year, our sport looks drastically different, and while we see some of the same trends happening, the balance between them is actually materially changing year to year. We don't see a static game. We've seen serving make huge improvements, and it doesn't actually result in fewer rallies. Defense is actually kind of keeping up with that a little bit. It's just not overtaking it, and I think that's what a lot of people are trying to get to. So let's talk about objectives here. I think that everyone's main objective here is more rallies, or a higher percentage of rallies, and also a higher percentage of points that can result in a rally. So we would call these quality defensive touches. We want to see more quality defensive touches that can turn into more rallies. There are a couple of caveats to this, though. 1, more rallies doesn't inherently mean that an idea is better. right now, we've done some analysis, not only on the board but in this rule change group that David Luis is running. If you want more information on that, please reach out to him. Great guy, doing really good things. And so we've done some analysis, and basically the rally percentage on playable or like the rally percentage overall in a match is somewhere between 5 and 8%. Now you also have to keep in mind that there's unplayable points in there as well. So you take those out. When we get more playable points, we see a higher percentage of rallies. And this is something that we actually saw specifically with adding double faults, because we started playing out more points, and then we saw an increase in rallies, but the same percentage basically. So that 5 to 8%. Now, defining what the goal of what we want is actually really important, but at the same time not being too attached to that. When people say like, all right, if we could just double that, if we could get to 15% or we could get to 10%, that'd be great. There are other people that say 30%, which I think is way too high. I think we need to not worry about that. I think what we need to do is see a material increase and promise of more increase, but we don't need to sit there and go, any idea that falls short of that is inherently a problem. If it falls a little bit short, that's okay, because once we start getting into the meta development around it, that number might go up or down. But if we change things and we start sending things in the right direction, that's always a good idea. So this is the basic theory on why I really think it's important to focus on buffs over nerfs. So when we talk about rebalancing something, we can't just balance it for the sake of balancing it. We can't get lost in trying to solve something in the middle that gets away from our ultimate goal of creating something that's more dynamic and more exciting. That's what we want to see. We want to see more points played out. We want to see more defensive touches. We want to see more of that stuff. But if we only focus on rallies, then we're losing the greater picture and we're forgetting about that excitement. So there are a couple of things that I look at when considering a rule change in general, beyond just buffs and nerfs. So in general, again, leaning towards buffs. One, also need to consider ease of implementation. So as soon as we start saying like, all right, we need to create a 25-foot boundary, that's actually really hard to implement. You can only fit like 10 courts on 10 or 12 on an entire football field that don't intersect. So in order to run a tournament with hundreds and hundreds of teams, which, our sport keeps growing, we would have to rent out so many football fields just to run that. And now all of a sudden our tournaments run at a massive loss and it's completely untenable. So that's not an option. It's just like, we have to think about those things as well. Or also like if it demands a massive equipment shift. These things aren't disqualifying on their surface, but ease of implementation is really important. And one thing that I talk about here, or that I want to talk about here, is that rule changes kind of fall into three categories, and I call them tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So tier 1 changes are changing how we implement a rule, but it requires nothing else. So a perfect example of this is sloppy first touch, where if you make one athletic motion, but it contacts you twice, that's legal. All we had to do is just change how we enforce that, but nothing else had to change. We didn't need a new set. We didn't need a new ball. We didn't need more observers. We didn't need a new line. We didn't need anything except for just, we're going to start calling things differently. These things are a lot easier to implement. You can lean a little bit more on theory than anything else. And they don't require that much testing to know that there's a material difference there. As long as it actually makes sense, and again, also has other benefits to it, these are pretty easy to adopt. So we actually adopted this rule on the board relatively quickly. I advocated for it for like 2 years before there was an appetite, but once there was a little bit more of an appetite, we didn't have to do that much testing around it. And actually, we definitely did some, but it wasn't a lot. And the idea here was just that it eliminated the benefits of eliminating gray area of, did that double off of your body block? There were so many times that there were honestly as many times where people were falsely called for double touching a ball as there were for people that double touched it and didn't realize it or cheated. And so it eliminated this gray area and said, like, if you're just doing one motion, which everyone can tell, and that ball goes up, we continue replay, which also gave more opportunities to continue to play out points, not only from those double touches, but also from eliminating those calls that were incorrect and killed points that were continuing to go. I was on the other end of this famously in 2016. I'm not going to reiterate, but I'm butthurt. Could have had one of my favorite wins ever. I digress. Two, the other thing that we need to consider when talking about rules is the effect on other rules in the sport. So some people say, like, if we just add this, it'll solve everything. But when you start seeing how that rule interacts with other rules in the sport, it demands other rule changes or creates exploits that then need to also be addressed. So one thing that came out of this, like a perfect example of this, was the double fault rule that was implemented at the beginning of 2019, I believe. Right? Was it 2019 or was it 2018? But basically, the idea was that as soon as we gave 2 serves, we were hoping to see more playable points. And that's exactly what happened. Basically, given 2 attempts, you were going to see more playable points. Maybe not a higher percentage of rallies because the meta hadn't shifted or anything. But if we're playing out, 40 points a match instead of 30 because we're eliminating more of these faults, then, we're getting an extra rally every game. 3, enforceability. So is this eliminating gray area or is this adding more gray area? Because what we don't want to do is create a sport that actually just comes down to more violations or disagreements. Those are really not hype. We actually saw this last weekend in the finals in Utah where everyone was saying, like, that we went to observers too many times. If we start creating rules that create more gray area and have more potential for disagreements, we're slowing down the game to a grinding halt. We're letting observers call things. And on top of that, we're largely a self-officiated sport. And so any rule that we have has to be pretty easily enforceable without observers at all. And people forget that too. They're like, oh, just throw observers in there. Like 98% of matches are not observed, especially in the lower divisions, especially in pool play. All those things are the majority of the tournament, so we can't get away from that. It's important to know that we can do it while self-officiating. Maybe it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect while self-officiating, like like some of the serving rules. Like it's tough to tell if someone like dragged their pivot foot while you're also receiving, but it's somewhat enforceable, so that's okay. You need something that's realistically enforceable and not going to come up repetitively over and over and over again as a problem. Whereas your foot dragging, usually it's pretty obvious when someone's close to doing it or doing it, when to pay attention and when to not. Like I'm not someone that drags their foot on a sidestep serve at all. So like pretty much you don't have to worry about that if you're officiating with me. The way I serve doesn't lead itself to do that. But someone like Travis Core that reaches out a little bit further, people are a little bit more concerned about that. Their partner knows to look for it. It's really not that big of a deal. And that's just at the beginning of a point. When you start having things that are enforceable in the middle of a point, it gets way more complicated. And even something like whether or not someone touched the set in the middle of a point is sometimes really hard to self-officiate. Obviously, it's a good rule. But once you start getting more complicated than that, it really starts to show that like it might not be a good idea. Or it's something that we need to look forward to eventually once we have referees. I think everyone agrees that our sport's moving towards referees, but we don't have them yet. So we can't write rules for that. But you can save all of your ideas that work with referees for when there are referees, like the challenges that we were talking about in that way too. You can't implement a challenge system if there aren't referees because there's no ruling on the field to challenge. As long as we're self-officiating or as long as we're doing observers that only are breaking disputes, the challenge itself is going to observers. So you can't create a challenge to a challenge or you start penalizing teams for being wrong. There's tons of reasons why that's also not a good idea. We'll get into it at some other point. That's really not the point here. But that's important. And then some other things that obviously I think some people focus too much on this, but it's important to mention, like understandability to a viewer or the watchability factor. We don't want to create a rule that's so specific or so difficult to comprehend initially if it pops up all the time. If it's something that pops up on occasion, that's a different story. So when we see like a sloppy first touch, like on ESPN, Joel got a block with both of his knees, went back off the net, and that was ruled good. That was a good time for a small rule like that to be explained to the viewers without inhibiting their ability to watch the entire game. So rules like that are fine. They can be specific, but they can't be something that pops up literally as a necessity of the sport. We can't sacrifice the quality of what we're going for just for quantity. So again, if we're only focused on improving rallies, but we don't care what those rallies look like, that's not the point. The point isn't just to create more rallies for the sake of rallies. Again, that balloon example is exactly my point. Like, we don't want that just to, like, all right, we have more rallies, therefore it's the best idea. That's not the case either. So when people say, like, well, how much testing would you need to see that this increases it to 15% before you'd say yes? The answer would be, like, I'd want to see a lot, and I would want to see what the quality of that play looks like. Also, given some time. If we only let people play things out for a month, we're not seeing how that strategy develops at all, or, maybe there's some gains initially that then get taken away, or maybe 3 months in we discover, oh, there's all this new area to be able to explore. And so what that does by buffing in general and creating more options for someone to do as opposed to fewer, there's more opportunity to explore, more room for teams to bring their unique aspect and their unique skills in and prove what's a good idea and what's not a good idea. Like the people that first came up with playing body defense, like watching what Strange Embrace did early in 2015, like they came up super fast doing really, really good with that. And it centralized the meta towards that. Before, it was far less common to see body defense. Obviously, like Chico was doing it a little bit. I mean, a lot of it, but I don't know. Strange really changed the narrative on that, I think. And seeing the push and pull that like Fitzy and Alvino do, I think is cool too, where they're playing some body, they're playing some long, they're doing a combination thereof. They're both at their net, they're both long, they're both short, they're mixing it up. That's the kind of stuff I like to see as well. So how the sport looks is really important. We can't just sit here and say, like, once we find something that gets us to 15% rallies, we're good. That is not the case. Like, it has to also be dynamic and exciting. Otherwise, what's the point? We're just nerfing ourselves into a perfectly fair game. And if we wanted a perfectly fair game, we should all show up to tournaments and play best of 5 rock, paper, scissors through the entire bracket. That would be perfectly fair. But no one wants to do that. That's not what anybody wants. So what do we do in the meantime? In the meantime, we need to be exploring major rule changes and thoroughly vetting them. One, they need to be well written. They need to be well thought out, well written out, well argued against, and you need to actually take the time to write into the existing rules what you want to see. So any rule change that is going to be described and something that might be adopted needs to include these numbers in there. Like if we go to here and we go to the serving rules, if you want to create new serving rules, here's the starting positions. Where's 6 feet? So you would say in 4.4.1, we're going to rewrite the rule to say all parts of the server's body and the ball must start behind the 2 meter serving line. Must start behind the 2 meter serving line, and the feet must remain behind as well. Before serving, the center must set there. Yeah. So some of this stuff stays the same. Some of it gets changed. If you want to change from 4 inches, you got to describe what that is and why, all that stuff. So additions into the rules and the things that you're changing in the rules. That way we can all play by the same rules when we're testing it. That's important. And 2, these things just need to be tested a lot better. So I was talking about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. I think I stopped talking about tier 3. But tier 1, super easy to execute. We just need to change how we enforce it. 2 is it's a larger implementation rule change. It might require some slight changes, but nothing that's going to be costly or super meta changing. Slightly meta changing, but not overly meta changing. Ease of implementation is a 2, 3, or 4 out of 10 on the difficulty scale. And then there's tier 3, which is we need a new set, we need a new ball, we need a hitting circle around the net, and we need something to be able to put down in order to call that a dead zone. Like now we're talking about changing equipment. We're talking about investment in that as well. Those are the things that need to be vetted extremely carefully before we start just broadly putting them out there. This was like something that could have been a disaster when we changed from the regular set to the pro set, because it had been marginally tested. But we were in the very early days of this. It had been marginally tested, but things are drastically different between those sets. And I think if we had known the amount of spin that you'd be able to generate on that ball, I think we might have changed the ball initially, and not had to go back and do that later. This doesn't mean that it's inherently a bad idea, but it is just to say, like, we should be doing our due diligence and not changing the sport drastically in an instant. It should be pretty obvious that that's going to happen. It should be known to the community that this is being addressed. It should be known how the progress of that is going. So if we were going to do a 1 foot circle around the net or a 2 foot circle around the net that you can't be in while you contact the ball as a hitter, you wouldn't want to just do that over an off season. It's not equitable to change that so drastically without warning people for like a full year that that's coming, so that they can kind of practice on both. They can start testing out that stuff while also competing on something. Obviously, something's got to change from 1 year to the next. But when it's major like that, like, you got to give people warning. Otherwise, it's just not good. So those are those tier 3 ones that I would say are like, you really, really, really gotta know that that's the way you want to go, have explored what that looks like, taken out to its extreme, and then go from there. So I think tier 3 changes should really be for the most extreme of circumstances, or if it necessitates immediate player safety. That's something as well. But usually player safety stuff can be done on the margins as well. And we saw that with the playing inside the cylinder. Obviously, eliminating that was like a slight nerf to defense, if you want to call that defense. I would not. So that's a little bit, I think that pretty much sums everything up. I think that's where I line up on things. All right, I'm going to leave it at that, but those are my thoughts from one board member. Want to hear what you guys have to think, though, so obviously reach out on all socials, Instagram, Twitch, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, all those places. Reach out. Let me know what you're thinking. And my next follow-up is going to be my proposed rule change. So now that you have the fundamental theory of what I'm trying to do, you'll probably understand my proposal a little bit more and why I'm trying to tackle this in a completely different way, and why I think that everyone else should advocate for tackling our problems this way.